Symposium. And of course, you may have to unmute yourself. It'll help us because.
Just saw
And
I
that
promise
detail.
I will mute myself here, okay?
yeah. Okay.
Morning. Great. Well, it's morning here. It's not morning there. That's one of the language assumptions that we have to be careful with when we're talking about a world that is one ball and east is west or west is east. So all those things are relevant.
But Francis, even the word east and west on a sphere, how is something east and how is something west? Also, I have to figure this out. how is
top and bottom.
Yeah, I mean, really, yes, I really feel sometimes you say the Western countries, west to whom? West to from where? Everything from here, you can go all around the east, also reach there. So I don't know, that's another discussion. So Francis, thank you very much. Of course, you'll have to tell us about yourself and you'll give me 30 seconds to tell people where to find information about what I'm doing. And then we'll go into language and mediation. So please, Francis, a little bit about yourself.
Right. Good morning again, and to other viewers if they who are there and so on. I want to say from the outset, I do not do a lot of day-to-day mediation. I have been a mediation administrator, so to speak. I have organized mediation in a number of court systems, but I also trained. I also trained to be a mediator on a number of occasions. And but my principal job is a judge. I'm a judge in the Court of Appeal of Barbados, and I also adjudicate cases in the United Nations Dispute Tribunal as what they call a half-time judge. However, because of my mediation training, I'm able to spot when cases are more likely to be successfully mediated. And, I have been doing so from the time I was a high court judge up to now in the Court of Appeal. I still can spot some of those cases, and sometimes those mediations are successful. But I have a lot to say on this because I think that I mediate in that sense from where I sit. And on a day-to-day basis, I think like a mediator in terms of helping in problem solving and coming up with ideas about how people should organize their business, etc. So, in brief, I'm a lawyer, of course. I'm to be a judge, I had to become a lawyer, which I've been in the legal profession for 36 years, and as a judge for 18 years. So that has obviously had a big impact on my life. And I once worked in a trade union situation, so I'm familiar with the language of conciliation that I heard earlier. So these kind of experiences have influenced what I have to say and what I do and what I would like to continue doing in the future after I stop being a judge. So I suppose that's a good enough introduction, Vikram, for the time being.
Yeah. And I think your session in the last symposium was, I think, very nice, and people can find that on YouTube. Just search Mediator Vikram and Francis Belle, you'll find that. Because the important thing is, Francis, you have that mediator mindset, and that's what matters, and that's the most important part. We were talking about certifications and all that. No one can put the mindset in you. No, nothing in the world can put that mindset in you. If it could be done, there will be nothing better. So that would have been the only thing required. So I'll give me 30 seconds to say, go to mediatorvikram.com if you want to find information, because the social media posts, not the easiest to find, because they will show you what they want to show you. And the World Mediation Circle is what is the focus area now. So Francis, Barbados Mediation Circle, Brazil Mediation Circle, Malu, all that has to happen. And of course, Patron, gift, events, all that you'll find there. So no more time for you. With yours, Francis, language and mediation, all yours.
Right. Well, thanks again. And I should tell Malu that I know a couple of Brazilian mediators, actually, who I met through the Weinstein Foundation They are senior fellows of the Weinstein Foundation, as I am. And that's a foundation out of the United States, which was connected, and I think still is connected to JAMS, which is a law firm that does mediation in the United States. So anyway, that's a good place to start, because JAMS is a law firm doing mediation. Obviously, they practice would be focused on matters that are being referred from the court. And that is what I have a lot of experience with too, in relation to training mediators, making sure that we have sufficient numbers of mediators, and that the mediations are, the facilities are there and the mediators are doing their job. So I wanted to just start off with the definition that I would hope to work with of language, which is a principal method of human communication consisting of words used in a structured and conventional way and conveyed by speech, writing, or gesture. And I want to confine my what I said today to 3 areas, of course. That would be area of mediation when it comes to the law and what is done in a court-connected mediation situation. Mediation when it comes to dealing with violence, which is very prevalent in this part of the world. And you know, no one has really totally figured it out yet, although there have been many interventions that attempt to deal with it. I think Vikram just mentioned one, or no, was it Vikram? It was mentioned that anyhow just now that there are mediators that actually go and mediate with gangs, yes. And in the United States, I think it is, and I'm aware of that as well. And then mediation in an area that I have written about, which is disaster preparedness. And this has become very relevant, of course, because of climate change and so on, that is hitting us everywhere, and more lives are being affected in that area. And as long as lives are being affected, you can rest assured there's a need for people to be involved in mediation, involved in solving conflict that arises out of the dislocation, destruction, etc., that happens in disasters. Now, when you look at the law or court-connected mediation, kind of mediation, you'll recognize that immediately you are surrounded by lawyers, the language of the law, the thought process of the law, winners and losers. You know, I recall hearing one lawyer describe why he liked the law, and he said he liked the cut and thrust of it. Listen carefully to those words, the cut and thrust of it. Cut and thrust is language that is derived from fighting with a sword, where you cut the person and then you finish them off with a thrust. Cut and thrust has nothing to do with solving human problems. It has to do with fighting to the death. And basically, this is one of the reasons I think why the adversarial system has been found wanting in the area of a lot of disputes. And you know, the natural tendency, for example, in construction, is that those disputes will go to arbitration, etc. So because they realize that at the end of the day, there's a lot of technical knowledge that has nothing to do with being a lawyer that will help engineering, etc., that would help people to resolve disputes in that particular area. And you can almost go to almost every single area that goes before a court, including criminal law, where a lot of times the cut and thrust approach is not going to really provide a solution. It may provide a sentence, it may provide a decision, but not a solution. And to illustrate what I mean, I was told, and I must say that this is obviously hearsay, but I was told that you have situations, for example, in some communities, not just in this island where I live, but in other islands, where certain families are always in court. They're always there. There's some problem between two cousins, or there's some problem between an uncle and a nephew, somebody is always involved in violence or something. And they go to the court, and the court makes an order, oh, you keep the peace and be of good behavior for 6 months or 2 years or whatever. Otherwise, we will, put you in jail, or you will have to pay a fine, et cetera, et cetera. And yet they're back within 6 months for another alleged offense, as nobody is really trying to find out what is the real problem between these people. The idea is simply to find a way of speaking to the immediate issue, which is, well, you throw a stone and broke your neighbor's window, and we have to deal with that. There is, of course, if you dig deep enough, you would find out that sometimes the fracture has to do with one gentleman had 2 families from 2 different women, or sometimes he could have had them from 3 different women. And these families are now fighting for the resources of that one man. Not necessarily that they wake up every day and say, well, we're going to fight for the resources of this one man, but they see it as competitive. They see it as inherently, if I am to survive, you must maybe not survive, or I have to take something from you, etc. So obviously in those kinds of conflicts, the language is going to be very hostile. And that's where the cut and thrust language seems to obviously fit. The accusations are going to be about people taking, and there's going to be very little talk about giving. There's going to be talk of, alleging that so-and-so maybe is a nuisance or a troublemaker. There's going to be very little talk about love or family affiliation, getting together, having a conversation. There's going to be very little talk about that kind of language. So I thought that it is important to understand that even though a lot of these things end up in the court system, and then from the time they get in there, they're restricted by the rules of evidence and the procedural rules, et cetera, and of course, the legal approach of the cut and thrust. This is not necessarily the context in which solutions will be provided, but these are only the contexts in which the persons will be dealt with according to the law. And it doesn't necessarily lead to problem solving. So you have heard me refer to, look at that kind of dichotomy between, somebody accusing somebody being a troublemaker, but never saying, but we're family and we love each other, or we should talk, or we want to have a good conversation, rather than he was cussing me, we were cussing one another. And sorry, the way I pronounce cussing is what we call Bajan. It's cursing. It's English. We say cussing, and that is something to do with that is how I would look at the whole language situation when we have that clash of cultures in the law courts situation. Now, very interestingly enough, I kind of broke into a little area, a little minor, should I call it minor? An important area, because it is very difficult to function as a mediator or as a lawyer in cultures like the one in which I live, like mine, without knowing the dialect. So you have to know what a person means when they say cussing, as distinct from cursing. Okay, and they actually will be a difference sometimes between the two, because the cussing is what goes on between people that probably know one another, and the cursing may be something that is in a different, is seen in a different context. You use bad language in a public place, that is cursing. Cussing means somebody else is involved, and that immediately connotes that there is a conflict between two people. So that kind of aspect of language is also something that needs to be appreciated, that there are words that are going to be used that are different from what we learn in school. There are words that we learn in the street, in the home, et cetera, that have a different meaning to what you would expect them to have from reading, you know, the important English text, et cetera, et cetera. And this is very important to understand. So when you're in the law courts, you're looking at damage, you're looking at compensation, what is supposedly correct and what is incorrect. You're looking to, the law is supposed to make all decisions legitimate, but you're not really necessarily looking at as to whether or not you're solving the underlying problem. So the language has to be restricted because it isn't interested in solving the underlying problem. It is interested only in fitting into the precedent and the procedure and the rules. And as long as it does that, it is satisfying. So I hope that that little introduction in relation to language and the law and the referrals that you would get from a court to mediate, where even though you as a mediator may be trained to try to think differently, you're going to have lawyers involved who are going to try to make sure that the constraints of the law are always impinging upon it. They may not be successful, but that is going to be part of the experience. I do recall attending some mediation sessions, actually in the United States, where the mediators very skillfully avoided being drawn into legal arguments. You know, someone would make a point of, well, this construction firm, anything they did was wrong because they didn't have a license. And it's, well, we're not here talking about licenses, you know. We're here talking about what is the solution to the problem that has resulted from whatever this particular firm did. Because to simply say they didn't have a license may not resolve the problem at all, because all that may mean is that they can't get paid, but who are you going to get to know do the work? So that is the point that those are the kind of points that need to be made in relation to the law and mediation, and when the two converge and attempt to solve problems, the mediator's skills have to be honed towards making sure that the language of the law, the attitude and the approach of lawyers, the cut and trust, the adversarialism does not control the platform. Okay, so I move on to the mediation and violence. Now, this is something that I became very interested in because, as I said, of my circumstances in the region. When I say in the region, I mean in every single country where I have worked and countries where I have studied, which would include, of course, Barbados, where I am now, Jamaica, where I studied, St. Lucia, Grenada, Antigua. These are small islands, very small populations, relatively speaking, but there is, relatively speaking, a lot of personal violence in these countries connected to different types of criminal activity, but also connected to what I spoke to just now, which is things start to fall apart from within the home, from the family relations, from actions, behaviors of people, ancestors that left behind certain rifts over what they created, and individuals now are not equipped to kind of say, well, you know, let bygones be bygones. Let's try to see how we can work together with the resources that are left behind. So the violence that we see sometimes has that kind of root. But I also want to argue that, and to say, because argue is also, of course, the language of war. I want to say that we have violence, I think, partly because of our history, but partly because the prevalence of the the history of slavery, the history of colonialism, which we got rid of slavery since the mid-19th century, but the colonial past is, up to the 1960s, and in some cases 70s, in some cases the 80s, the colonial structures were still there. And it meant that the population really had to be satisfied to be second-class citizens, and people giving them orders, basically, that were coming from elsewhere and not within the community itself. So I think we had to go through that period where we're trying to find our own way as independent nations. And obviously people will see this as a lease on freedom, but the freedom has to be, at the end of the day, there still has to be some kind of control, some type of community agreement, consensus as to how we operate within this free atmosphere. And this is where then the language has to change. And we have to, again, try to look at, I think the language that is used in Getting to Yes is appropriate in the circumstances. That is, you have to look at interests. We have to look at how we listen very carefully to the different interests that people tend to propagate, and see how we can let them open some door, some window to them having an understanding that they share a similar interest. The Barbados where I reside is 166 square miles. There are some cities that are probably bigger than that in other parts of the world. You have a population of less than 300,000. Again, some boroughs in cities are probably larger than that. So really and truly, we are, some people would describe it, a village. In some countries, we've been looked at like a village. But yet, there's still this struggle to learn how to get along with your interests versus my interests, and at least that is how people see it. If you're struggling over this and you're struggling over that, and of course, your different structures, different class structures, the ability to exist within the economic situation, et cetera, gives rise to crime and different kinds of conflict, which has to be confronted by the law. And unfortunately, again, we haven't really found a way of dealing with this. One of the things that was mentioned earlier by speaker in the earlier session was this whole question of mediators being used to help to deal with the violence between different communities, different individuals, different gangs, etc. And it's interesting to find out what kind of language they use when they are, because it's an inherently, the language in those circumstances is going to be inherently difficult. It is one of the things I encountered, for example, in one of the islands where I worked, was an offense that was committed because one individual called another one a punk. You call somebody a punk, that is supposed to be an insult. As soon as the individual heard that he was being called a punk, he was on a bicycle, he stopped, he turned around, went back and stabbed the person who called him a punk. That was all it required. You are a punk. And he came back and committed an offense. So there's a lot of talk about conflict resolution, anger management. A number of you might have seen, movies, including Medea, which Medea is sent for anger management, etc. in the United States. This is how the movies deal with it. But of course, these are real situations where we have to, again, have the time, the facility, the training to be able to look to see what is happening with these people and be able to relate to their language, relate to their experience, listen carefully to what they're saying and how they're saying it, and show empathy where that is required. So we have to have the language of empathy. We have to have the language of understanding, and the language that shows that we are listening. So you said that this person always was troubling you. That's what I heard you say. Can you explain what you mean by that? And so on. Rather than why you didn't just ignore him? Well, he's not brought up to just ignore somebody who is making him feel some kind of disturbance. So he's brought up to react. So cannot introduce that by a question. You have to gradually work your way into getting him to understand that things will be much better if he learned how to hear what was being said and process it, and then work out a better way to respond. And this is where the use of language in the circumstances becomes important, and where the use of language for the mediator involved becomes very important, because they don't want to hear anything that makes it sound as though they're going to come out as losers, and a lot of us have become very familiar with that word in recent years. They don't want to come out feeling that they are in any way subdued, or they're not victorious in this struggle that they have with this other person or group of persons already. So you have to be able to work your way within the structures of thought and language to get them to understand. And this is not about what they're going to lose, it's what they're actually going to gain, understanding, and a way of living with the other side that will allow them to go forward. But there's a lot of, there are a lot of signals that continue to be in the community that contribute to conflict. I referred to the history of colonial oppression, the whole question of rich and poor and class conflict. There's still race conflict issues that raise their head every now and then, and the whole question of distribution of wealth. Actually, I recently there's now a discussion about constitutional reform since we recently became a republic, because a lot of people, I don't think, would understand that even though Barbados was independent since 1966, and that means independent from Great Britain, we still had in our constitution, the Queen of England as our head of state. So that, to be changed, we had to become a republic, and that happened the year before last. And the Republican Constitution, however, is not really yet in place, so that has to now be worked upon. So that whole experience in producing a new constitution, one of my proposals was there has to be a clause in there in which the executive must demonstrate at all times its dedication to a fair distribution of wealth in the country. That is something that they should pay attention to. There'll be different understandings of how that can work and so on and so forth. Again, we get back to language. How we gonna talk about that? How are we gonna explain that? I know people will start to talk about you're a socialist and you're this and you're that. Language, again, words with different meanings, they're being thrown at you. But the question at the end of the day is, well, do we really want this country to be operating as much as possible, as a united body of people, as much as possible? It will never be totally so. Or do we want us to be constantly fractured and fighting against one another? There has to be an idea of how the wealth of the country, in which most people contribute something, is fairly distributed. And then we have to look at the experiences of small communities like ours, and try to understand how those limitations affect conflicts. Question of small size, question of options. You don't have the kind of options. Somebody tells you, I remember the situations where I recall being in the criminal court, and I would hear that somebody's bail condition was that they must not leave such and such a district. Well, what that meant is that the person probably could not leave an area of less than 1 square mile. They had to stay in an area of less than, that's like being in a prison, okay? If you're in the United States or Brazil or India or wherever, you're told to not leave a particular, let's say, not leave the district of Delhi. How many square miles are you talking about, right? It's a different story altogether. So I always balk at that when I hear that, but you really expect a young person, maybe 25 years old or so, not to leave, to live in a little area like that without feeling that they're imprisoned. It's really difficult. So we have those realities as well that we have to deal with. Now the third point in relation to the third area of language use that I have an interest in when it comes to mediation, which I have written about, is that of disaster preparedness and the disaster response and so on. Now, the language used by disaster experts is that we have the process of mitigating disaster, is the process of preparedness, response, and then recovery. Now, mitigation usually falls in the area of what is the state doing before, on a continuous basis, to try to ensure that when a disaster happens, this doesn't happen again, that doesn't happen again. So flooding doesn't happen in area B, the roads don't get washed away in area C, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So that's mitigation. And you immediately come to the conclusion there, you can conclude there that the choices of mitigation, areas in which mitigation would be applied, et cetera, often will be influenced by politics. So the language issues are going to arise because you have to be able to ensure that the entire country feels and sees evidence that you are trying to mitigate loss throughout, and it isn't that you have certain districts that are neglected, etc. And that is where I find that a mediator can come in when a particular community reacts maybe to something that happens and somebody's speaking to them, or we're going to do X, Y, Z, but is it really going to be mitigation? Then somebody needs to be really listening carefully. People who live in the district tend to know what happens. Water comes down from the hill and it just washes the road away. So you got to deal with the hill. You can't just deal with the road because you got to try to understand what is happening here. Understanding, listening, okay? Having a good idea of how you talk to people who go through that kind of desperate experience again and again and again is very, very important in a mediation, that will arise in this kind of situation. So preparedness tends to fall into the same category. Again, it's usually left to government institutions to deal with, and they have their instructions. The question is, were the instructions well informed? To what extent was the community itself involved in informing those instructions? Who is listening? Who is helping to interpret what is being said? It's not interpretation of a foreign language, it's interpretation of feelings, interpretation of experience, interpretation of how people think this thing can be dealt with based on their experience versus what the so-called experts think they should impose. There is response. After the event, what is going to happen? what kind of resources are going to be called in? Who are the resources who are going to be the people that are dispensing these resources? Is it the military, police, people from overseas, whoever? How well do they know the community in which they are operating? How well do they understand the behavior and language and the needs? And therefore, part of the response has to be the ability to talk to people again, listen, understand their issues. They're feeling sometimes that they're being neglected because they're not somebody else. So they're seen different. And then there's recovery. And we're listening to the news every day from Turkey and Syria, and you know, the news media deal with it in a particular way. You know, they show some of the suffering. They show people are still being pulled from under the rubble, et cetera, et cetera. They can't show, of course, how decisions are being made and the extent to which there's any intermediary to help to understand how that desperation and pain that the people are going through is being mitigated in these circumstances. So this is where the language again has to be developed to handle those circumstances that they're not easy to repeat. They will be repeated when there's another disaster. They're not going to be happening on a day-to-day basis, but people have to be ready for it when it happens. So as I said, you have persons who are chosen to intervene in these circumstances. You know, one of the things that used to happen, and I'm hearing about it in the Turkey situation, is that there's looting. And how do you respond? How do you respond? Is there a role for a mediator, a person who has a way of speaking to individuals who may get involved in looting that may help them to show that you're not making things any easier? It means now that you're turning in the little resources that we have available, you are creating a situation which is competitive now, and it's going to be survival of the fittest, or the strongest, or the one with the biggest guns, or the most guns, or something like that, rather than any attempt to really make sure that everybody gets some food, everybody gets medicine, everybody gets water, everybody gets sanitation, sanitary conditions, etc. And the extent to which security forces are trained to be able to at least have that conversation. There's some book I read where they were talking about, and it isn't a mediation, but it shows how how when you construct a particular circumstances in a particular way, what difference it can make. And what it was talking about is some U.S. Army, U.S. military contingent, either in Afghanistan or Iraq, and they came upon this hostile group of men, and who were also armed, and the question was, well, what is going to happen here? And the commander sensibly in that particular situation told his platoon to kneel and point their guns downward and listen and watch. And that gesture, as distinct from one in which they pointed the guns at the other persons, made the difference in what could have been a total disaster and a massacre, either by one side or the other or both. So that quick thinking, that ability translated into language, the ability to look at a situation and realize what's happening and say, hey, we have to have the language here of kneeling. Well, not kneeling and bowing and saying we are submitting, but the language that says we are not here on a hostile mission. We want to wait to hear what you're about, and then we will tell you what we're about, and maybe we can talk, right? But obviously the guns have to be lowered, and we cannot be standing looking like giants. We have to be to reduce our size. It's very important. We have to reduce our size. As I was telling somebody one day, I was walking on a sidewalk, and you know the whole thing about increasing your size is a natural instinct. So that I was walking on the sidewalk and a lizard was in front of me. And all of a sudden the lizard turned and popped its head up in the air, as though it could take me on. I said, well, that lizard, that's survival instinct. That's survival instinct. Of course, I paid respects to the lizard and I walked around the lizard. And the whole point that I'm making is those physical gestures, as the definition said, language is also in gesture. So what the lizard was saying to me is, I can take you on. And I said, of course, we're not getting into that, lizard. Not today. And I walked around. And you have to be careful, therefore, when we use the language that we use in mediation, that you're not encouraging, I can take you on kind of language versus how can we talk? How can we how can we lead this to a conversation that we need to have in order to get to the next step of understanding? So, you know, and before I leave, COVID gave life to a lot of, you know, the kind of issues that I think mediators can get involved in, where of course there were those who vaccinators versus anti-vaccinators, persons who never got tested versus persons who got tested, persons who feel that there were other medications versus the vaccine, et cetera, et cetera. Again, there had to be an attempt to try to understand how these things can happen in a public health crisis in a situation of, because that was a disaster in a sense. It was a pandemic. And we ought to have learned a lot from that pandemic in relation to conflict resolution and how we talk to people who don't necessarily buy in to what the state is saying at the very beginning. And I'm not advocating that we oppose what the state is saying from the very outset. We have to listen carefully. We have to understand what their concern is. Their concern is they're responsible, they're elected in many cases to serve the community, and they want to appear to be doing so by making sure that the disease doesn't spread. How they go about doing so, these are things that we can talk about. And as long as we can talk about it, language becomes important. How we talk about it. How do we deal with the ones that are the naysayers that are saying, I'm not doing that. I'm good. I'm not going to get it, you know, for whatever reason they think so, et cetera, et cetera. So that is basically what I wanted to say about language. You know, I am not in a position to give you, well, chapter and verse, this is what you should say in this instance, this is what you should say in that instance, et cetera. But I'm giving you what I think are the instances that require training, preparedness, and a ready response in order to deal with them effectively. Otherwise, we will not get as much out of our conflict resolution and mediation skills as we would have hoped to get. So that would be my
It was really nice. Thank you, Francis. The only thing is, how big was that lizard?
a little one.
Because this is something.
But its culture is, if you can't outrun this guy, you have to face him and fight. And I said, I honor you, lizard, for thinking that you can take me on. And I'm saying, congratulations, you got my attention. I'm going to leave you alone.
But you spoke about the Weinstein Jams Fellowship. I actually started a series called Mediator Experiences. And it was basically for Weinstein Jams Fellows. So I've 23, I don't know, you'll know most all of them, I think. You'll know all of them.
Actually, there are quite a few of them who I've never met. As I was saying earlier, there's Gabriela from Brazil. I know her fairly well. And she's one that I've met for sure, because I went to a conference in Peru about 4 years ago, and I met them, Gabriela, face to face. I know Ivan.
Doing a wonderful work.
Who's from Peru.
Because Gabriela and I have had lots of conversations on various topics. Heart, soul, spirituality has been one area that we've had. She's been on various shows, so it's been wonderful
Right.
conversations with her.
Right.
Ivan is doing wonderful work in Peru. All
Yes.
these infrastructure projects and the communities being affected there. So that's wonderful work there. And this continued up till the 23rd episode. The idea behind Mediator Experiences was to mediators to talk about their experiences, not necessarily in a mediation, but in the mediation world. But last one was with Alexandra. She's at the Poland-Ukraine border and
Oh,
working with
okay.
working with refugees there. So she's not a JAMS fellow. Up till now, 23 were all JAMS fellows.
Oh, okay.
So we have to have you on that show also, Francis.
Okay, no problem.
But what you spoke about was the larger role of mediators. I think that's what is
Yes.
required. That is something which actually this was something which Ken Cloke had written about. There are these, I mean, I'll show you this. I mean, of course, you find that link on my website also. So this was one he had put down the, that was one of his articles. Then he had written another one.
Yes. Yeah, I think I get the point with that heading.
Then he also had spoken about in relation to climate change,
Yes.
the role of mediators in that. So there is a lot larger role of mediators. It's not just the mediations, it's getting the conversations going and doing that. And of course, we had cut off Malu earlier. Malu, I'm sorry I had to cut you off, but for me, sessions have to go on time, and so I'm a little sorry about that. We'll of course discuss the point that you were making on mediation and conciliation, because only Brazil has done that. No other country has done that. That differentiation in law, only Brazil has. That mediation will be facilitative and conciliation will be evaluative, is only in your law that's provided for. Yeah.
That's okay.
Perfect. But
That's
yours,
fine. That's okay.
okay.
That's all right.
We wanted to ask
Thank
Francis
you.
something. Yeah, you wanted to ask Francis something. Did you?
That was very nice, Francis. I enjoyed very much your speech. I would like to ask you if you find, as your experience about being a judge, if you find a difference when you have parties separate from lawyers, and when you have lawyers together with them, you find it easier to conciliate parties without lawyers, or let me put things the other way, because in my own experience being a conciliator, mediator here, I find it much easier when they are without lawyers, when they are by themselves without lawyers. I would like to hear from you. What do you find? What is your? I mean, because I am in the small claim court, and it's the lawyers are not obliged to be present. So
give Francis a chance to answer.
I've observed, as I said at the very outset, I don't do much mediation myself, but I've observed the two. I've observed the mediation without lawyers in the small claims kind of court situation, and with lawyers. And I think you're right. The presence of lawyers sometimes doesn't help. This is why there's mediation training for lawyers, and how to conduct themselves in a mediation. So that's one of the things I think that has to be understood. The situation in the Caribbean with the mediation rules that I have worked with, as long as it's court-connected mediation, I think one of the compromises they made was that they require the lawyer to be present, the lawyers to be present, okay? I think that has to do with people not wanting to sign off on an agreement without the advice of a lawyer, without the final word from a lawyer. So the lawyers are often present in most mediations that are court-connected, but I have seen those circumstances, and I think you're right, in circumstances where the lawyers aren't present, then I think the mediator has the ability to exercise a bit more control in terms of leading the thinking, how we can go about this without people having to be probably wanted to look back and ask the lawyer, well, can we do that? Should I do that? And asking for the lawyer's advice. And that sometimes that advice would be, well, it's purely law related. It has nothing to do with problem solving. It has nothing to do with working things out. It's purely law related. So that's how I would answer the question. I think your instincts are right, that the absence of lawyers sometimes would help. Not in all cases, but sometimes it would help to work things out.
Because I think, Malu, the thing is, of course, we've had this discussion on the colonization, decolonization, and mediation symposium, that we have to, first of all, get out of that whole colonial mindset that all dispute resolution happens in courts and lawyers have to be part of it. That's a whole change of the mindset. Mediation is something which could have and should have developed totally separately, but it's got connected with the courts. So definitely we are taking that baggage of the colonial system into the mediation also, because Michael in his last thing was talking about how you're actually, it's not voluntary. There's no self-determination. All those things have been removed because of the court system. And the fact that you are settling because the judiciary is inefficient and they cannot decide on your matter, so you're going for mediation. That's not the right way to promote mediation. I mean, that's my idea of this World Mediation Circle and mediation circles, is that let this happen, let this continue, because we can't fight that system, but let's go down to the grassroots and create a whole culture. And I think Barbados, I think, Francis, seems to be a good place. Only 280,000 people. It should be a good example to set. Because you can imagine my city has almost 20 million people. And of course,
one of the things I must say is that the larger community, I think it's easier to find people with common interests because you need to, in order to almost to survive. Whereas you can be in a small place where it is assumed that everybody has the same interest, but you really, the larger conversation or narratives that control the conversation, those are so powerful in a small community that sometimes individuals with a certain outlook can be easily isolated, because they're not with the mainstream, and the mainstream is so powerful in those circumstances. So sometimes I kind of I think that I would thrive better in a larger community, but it is what it is.
Yes, it is what it is. So we'll have to try it out. Let's see how it works. But we, of course, are going to go down to schools. We start with the children. We'll go into communities. We'll start small, but I think this seems to be a good target. 280,000 people sounds really nice to me. Very workable. Very workable.
Yeah.
So Francis,
I had some experience with industrial relations, conflict resolution as well, but that was well before I was trained, and I was involved in, obviously, industrial relations negotiations in a trade union setting, and I think, of course, the situation there is that there's always a power struggle involved, and you have to be able to speak to that power struggle in terms of trying to and that's why I think they use the word conciliation, because they're aware that there's a constant power struggle, the employer versus the employee, and they're trying to get them to understand how to behave, more so than even who pays what and when, etc., etc. So I know how that operates as well.
So Francis, you want to just conclude some wrapping up, say, words
Yeah, so sure. It's as I said, I try to restrict myself to specific areas which I think are of very strategic importance in my particular setting. Where of course a lot of the mediation will come out of the law court situation as number one, and we have to evaluate that for what it is. It is not as effective as we would like, but it has its usefulness in terms of the court system, because the court system is overburdened. At least that is what is said. Overburdened. We need mediation in order to. But I agree with Vikram that if you restrict mediation to that, then you're really not getting the best out of mediation. And that is why I think that until we try mediation in dealing with the interpersonal violence and so on that exists in the community, and see how bit by bit, by talking to people, giving them the conflict resolution skills, helping them to work through the issues in the home, in the workplace, in other communities, etc. Until we are able to institutionalize that, or at least put people out there who have those skills in various settings, and help them to work with these different institutions and settings, we really will not be seeing the full impact of mediation skills. I really think so. And then, because again of being small islands in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, in my case, if global warming, etc., goes on, then parts of our very islands will begin to disappear. And we have already had to deal with some catastrophic hurricanes, etc. And we also have in some countries volcano, and of course earthquakes. So we have to be prepared, not just with the technocratic skills and the engineers, etc., but also the things that need to be talked about in terms of priorities, and how the communities are going to be involved in helping to solve these problems when they happen. So I think it's very important for mediators and persons involved in conflict resolution practice to look at all the skills that have been learned, and that those will include the use of language, the documentation, the way in which things are negotiated, etc., in those processes. So that's basically in a nutshell what I wanted to convey.
I think in terms of climate change also, I mean, wanting to create a climate change mediation circle, because what is happening in a community affects what happens at the global level. So let's see where we can work on dialogue and facilitation there. Some nice comments have been, Mandi has put some nice comments in the chat, but I'll just read it out fast. So nice thoughts. This expression that country is a body united. Could we say poetry is a free language, though illogical, more as accessible? Wonderful. As long as we can talk and listen, such beautiful things are heard. Thank you. Okay, that's what it is. So what I have to do is I'll end this session and let's start Malu's